Okay, so in the New Testament, we have these three letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're all attributed to the Apostle Paul, and they're basically instruction manuals for young church leaders. But for centuries, scholars have had this nagging feeling that there's more to the story. We're about to dive into a really fascinating literary puzzle, one that might just challenge what we think we know about these really important texts. And this right here is the central question we're tackling today. Now, we're pretty certain about 7 of Paul's letters. They're widely considered authentic. But these 3, the ones we call the pastoral epistles, they just stand apart. They feel different. And today, we're going to play detective and figure out exactly why. So I want you to think of this as a literary detective case. You've got scholars acting like textual forensic experts. And over the years, they've spotted all these little inconsistencies in the vocabulary, the writing style, the whole historical vibe that suggests these letters might not be from Paul at all, but maybe from a later follower writing in his name. So let's grab our magnifying glass and look at the evidence, one clue at a time. All right, our first line of evidence is the vocabulary itself. See, every author has a kind of unique verbal fingerprint, right? The words they like to use, the ones they avoid. And when we put the words in the pastoral epistles under the microscope, we find some pretty striking anomalies. Now get ready for this number because it's a big one. Out of 848 different words used in the pastorals, a staggering 306 of them appear absolutely nowhere else in Paul's undisputed letters. That is a huge number of new words. It really suggests we might be hearing a different authorial voice. This chart really helps put that number into perspective. We're talking over a third of the entire vocabulary is unique to just these 3 letters. I mean, think about it. If you wrote a bunch of emails to a friend, and then suddenly in the next few, a third of the words you used were completely new, they'd probably notice something was up, right? And here's the thing, it's not just that there are new words, it's which new words they are. Terms like eusebia, which means godliness or piety, are all over the pastorals, but they're totally absent from Paul's other letters. But where they do show up? They were super common among Christian writers in the 2nd century, guys like Ignatius of Antioch. It's like a linguistic breadcrumb trail leading to a later time period. Now, this right here is a bit more subtle, but it's an absolutely profound shift. In his authentic letters, when Paul uses the word faith, that's pistis in Greek, he's almost always talking about a personal trust, a relationship with Christ. But in the pastorals, it's become the faith, a fixed set of beliefs, a body of doctrine that has to be protected. This really points to a later, more institutionalized phase of Christianity. Okay, let's move on to our second clue and see how this all builds, the author's writing style. We're not just talking about word choice anymore. This is about sentence structure, rhythm, tone, an author's unique way of putting everything together. It's their authorial fingerprint. And wow, the contrast here is just stark. I mean, if you read Paul's letter to the Galatians, it's like listening to this urgent, passionate, sometimes even angry argument. His Greek sentences can be incredibly long and complex. But the pastorals, they're calm, they're formal, they're instructional, with much shorter, more straightforward sentences. It feels less like a personal letter and a whole lot more like a church manual. This little phrase is a perfect example of that formal, almost formulaic style. It shows up 5 times in the pastorals, always to introduce some trustworthy piece of teaching. It's like a stamp of approval. And it's a set formula that we just don't find in Paul's more spontaneous, authentic letters. It really hints at a time when traditions were being collected and solidified into these tidy little maxims. Our third and final clue takes us into the world behind the text. What kind of problems are these letters trying to solve? What's going on in the community? This is where the vocabulary and the style that we've just been looking at, well, this is where it all starts to make perfect sense. So here's the crucial point. The world of the pastorals looks a whole lot like the early 2nd century. The author is deeply concerned with establishing a formal church structure, with bishops and elders and deacons. They're fighting specific heresies like Gnosticism, which was this movement that claimed you needed secret knowledge for salvation. And they're obsessed with preserving sound doctrine. These were the defining challenges for the church a full generation, or maybe even more, after Paul's death. So, we've got clues from the words, the style, and the worldview. But what happens when we bring modern technology into this investigation? Well, this brings us to the really cool field of stylemetry. Stylometry is basically using computers to do what we've been doing by hand, but on a massive scale. It maps an author's unique fingerprint by analyzing hundreds of linguistic variables. It can then cluster text together, providing some really powerful quantitative evidence about who wrote what. And when scholars run this analysis, the result is completely unambiguous. Paul's authentic letters, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, they all cluster neatly together. But the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, they form a completely separate group. The computer is telling us that, statistically speaking, this is a different author. And now for the real knockout finding. This is just amazing. The analysis shows that another early Christian writer, Ignatius of Antioch, who we know is active in the early 2nd century, he actually imitates Paul's style more closely than the author of the pastorals does. That is a stunning piece of evidence. It suggests the pastorals are even further from Paul's authentic voice than we thought. So, where does all this leave us? Well, all the clues, the vocabulary from a later era, the formal institutional style, and a worldview concerned with 2nd century problems, they all point in the exact same direction. The dominant view in scholarship today is that the pastorals were written pseudonymously. That means a loyal follower wrote them, using the Apostle Paul's authority to help address the new and different challenges that were facing the church in the next century. And this brings us to the final, really crucial question. Knowing that these letters likely come from a later time doesn't have to diminish their value, not at all. But it does change how we read them. It shifts them from being Paul's personal advice to his buddies Timothy and Titus to being this incredible window into the struggles and the evolution of the early church right after the apostles were gone. It leaves us to wonder, what does authorship really mean for text authority? And that's a question worth thinking about.